Hi, everyone. It's Evelyn Ackah. Thank you so much for joining the Ask Canada Immigration Lawyer podcast. I'm thrilled today to have my dear friend, Wayne Baxter, joining us in LA. Hi, Wayne.
Greetings and salutations from sunny Southern California.
We have snow here, of course, in Calgary, and it's continuing to come down. But I wanted to thank you so much for joining me and our team on this podcast.
Okay.
Really appreciate it. I want to give our listeners some information about you so they have a context of where you're coming from, besides being
Sure.
a fellow Canadian. So Wayne works with families
Might find
reside.
a Tim Hortons cup of coffee.
We just moved to a new office and there's a Tim Hortons downstairs. It's crazy. Um,
Nectar of the gods.
You're hilarious. Wayne works with families residing in the U.S. and Canadian residents with U.S. investments and assets. He advises wealthy families on growing, protecting, and ultimately distributing their wealth in an effective and efficient manner according to their personal goals. His efforts aim to optimize the integration of a wealth management plan that encompasses the complexities of capital markets returns, risk management, tax, and liquidity management that having assets on both sides of the border brings. I know for sure you are the expert to talk to me and my clients about cross-border investments. So thank you so much for joining us, Wayne. So
Pleasure. It's a delight to be here, and I'm looking forward to our conversation today,
let's
wherever it takes.
wherever it takes us to the Tim Hortons. So tell me about your personal immigration story. Obviously, first and foremost, we are an
Oh
immigration
boy.
podcast, but you were a Canadian and you ended up in California.
Born in Toronto. I was born in Toronto, raised in the Annapolis Valley in Nova Scotia. I lived for
Nice.
6 years in Banff, Alberta.
Nice.
Ended up in back in Toronto area, and yeah, I could really take over this
Keep it
podcast.
short.
Yeah, exactly. This
So
I'll
I'm
give you
interested.
what I was thinking about this. I'm going to provide you with the Coles Notes version. Now down in the US, I get
I know the story. I
the
want to
Cliff
know
Notes. So
how you
I will
did
give you
that
the
book.
the Coles Cliff Notes version of what happened. So ultimately, what happened was I met the founder of One Capital Management while I was on vacation in California
Hmm.
in 2011. And that conversation, we naturally started our conversation talking about hockey, like
Of
any two good Canadian boys would.
course.
And when we ended up continuing our conversation, I was spurred on by an article I read in the Wall Street Journal one day while I was waiting for a client to show up, talking about how uh, a couple U.S. senators had come up with this bill they were proposing that would allow basically immigrants to immigrate to the United States if they were to buy real estate.
Ah.
And I read the article and I thought of my friend Don, who had moved from Winnipeg down to LA. And so I reached out to him and said, "How did you move to the US anyway?" And that led to a conversation. And by the time and I more than one conversation, and ultimately he said, "Listen, Wayne, if you'd like to relocate down to the US, why don't you come work with us? You can become our cross-border financial advisor."
Hmm.
So this was after spending 2 summers in a row renting a house in Malibu. And I must admit, by the end of the second summer, I was pretty much
Life is hard, isn't it?
seduced by the thought of living in that air part of the world. So I went talked to my wife about it, and her point of view was rather interesting. She said, "Well, if we don't do this, we're going to spend the rest of our life wondering, what if?"
Hmm. Hmm.
And then she says, "Well, besides, if you do fall flat on your face, somebody back in Canada will hire you anyway." So with that kind of a vote of confidence, I felt, what have I
Wow.
got to lose?
What do you have to lose? So when was this? When did you make that
This
move?
was
What year?
all took place. It all took place in the summer of 2000, July 2012. We
Okay.
crossed the border from Sarnia, Ontario, into Pure Herm, Michigan, and I'll never forget it. And
Ah,
I'll tell you, if there was a mistake to be made, I was able to find them.
back in
And
the
I
day.
can be the canary in the coal mine here from my client's experience. So yeah,
Wow.
well,
That's great.
anyway, it ended up with not only a trip across the border from Sarnia to Port Huron, but a second trip across the border from well, we went to San Diego across to
Mhm.
Tijuana. and then back across from Tijuana back into the US because we didn't have all of the right immigration documents naturally.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so anyway, we got that taken care of, and that began our journey, and it took me from my wife's F1 education visa to ultimately getting an
An
E2
E2. Yeah.
E2 investor visa, and then from there, I met an immigration attorney here in Encino, California. If I can give his name,
Of
John
course.
Perry, and
Yeah.
John. I told him about my experience, and he said, "Well." Ultimately, what we ended up doing was he took a look at all my professional experiences, and
Hmm.
concluded that I would qualify under the exceptional abilities program,
Of
and that's
course.
how I ended up being qualified for a green card. And just this past October, myself, my wife, and my two children became U.S.
Oh
citizens.
my God, that's exciting. I love to hear the story because it tells us that you can understand what your clients have to go through to get there, you know?
100%. Well, yeah, and again, like there's a lot, so many moving parts to the,
Yeah.
and again, one of the areas that we do a lot of work with
Mm.
families is
Hmm.
with people doing that actual relocation,
Yep.
either from the United States to Canada or from Canada to the US.
Yep.
And I always tell people if they're thinking about a relocation, the first person they need to speak to is
Yep.
an immigration attorney
Well,
before they speak to number one person, after they get the idea conjured up in their mind,
yes.
the next conversation should be with an immigration attorney.
I say that, but I also say tax first and then
I,
wealth management and then us because a lot of things drive the immigration
yeah,
decision, right?
I could debate that. Not that I want to contradict you, but I would think you and the tax person one and two in either
Yeah.
order. And
Yeah.
once the immigration attorney says yes, we have a pathway that will make that makes sense, and the tax
Yeah.
advisor says here's what you need to think about, then you start thinking more longer term in wealth management.
I
But
hear that. I hear that.
immigration tax to me are like
They
especially
go
with the folks
together.
the type of clients that we work with,
Yeah,
100%.
it makes a
They
big
need to.
difference. So tell us, Wayne, about how you got into this cross-border wealth management area because it is quite unique. You're my go-to because not everybody understands both sides of the border for wealth management.
Well, I had the good fortune of meeting the founder of One Capital Management. His name is Don McDonald, who is another fellow Canadian who moved from Winnipeg down to Los Angeles and ultimately established One Capital Management back in 2001.
Mhm.
And throughout that decade, from 2001 through to the end of the decade, that firm started working with firms. They're at what you would call a fee-only fiduciary portfolio manager. So they build investment portfolios on a discretionary basis using individual stocks, bonds, ETFs. And
Mhm.
they were doing that here in the US. And because of Don's contacts back in Canada, they started doing that same work for Canadian clients.
Okay.
First as a sub-advisor and ultimately as a portfolio manager registrant.
Mm.
So they had the ability to and their licensing allowed them to basically buy stocks, bonds, and ETFs in both countries. So when Don met me, and given the experience I had of working in Canada as a financial advisor for several years, he said, you could come down here and become our cross-border financial advisor. So that's ultimately how it all happened.
That's great.
And it's basically a relationship-driven business where it's the relationships you have with other financial advisors who aren't similarly licensed,
Mm.
uh, with immigration attorneys, with CPAs, with estate planning attorneys. I would say being the most often group that will be a good connection or referral source. And they
Mhm.
start introducing you to clients that are either they have relocated and they have liquid assets back in the country where they came from, or they're thinking of moving. Either they're moving from Canada to the United States because they've been recruited by an
Yeah.
employer. A
Yeah.
lot of my clients are STEM based, science,
Yes.
technology, engineering, math professionals, and they get recruited and
Yep.
they decide that they're going to make the move. And all of a sudden, they're married, they got a house, car, 2 cars in the garage, kids, and RSPs and TFSAs and non-registered accounts and who knows what else. And all of a sudden,
Mhm.
they're thinking about a relocation.
Wow.
And
So
again,
what do
lots
you
to think about.
And it's a lot to think about. So, what do you think are the unique challenges, Wayne, and maybe the opportunities as well that Canadians face when they're moving to the US with investment assets. So they get dinged from a big multinational company. There's a lot of them I'm hearing are bringing Canadians down all the way down to Arizona, wherever they have.
Challenges. There are a few. Again, I'll highlight a couple here. So the first thing is if you have a TFSA, tax-free savings account, and let's say you've been funding it since inception back in 2008, 2009, you probably accumulated a significant amount of money in that plan. Well, as of now, to the best of my knowledge, once you become a U.S. resident, that TFSA loses its tax sheltered benefit.
God.
So you may not want to keep that in your portfolio. You may not want to keep those proceeds in your TFSA. That's one thing. Another thing that you want to think about, and again, depending on the CPA you talk to, and I've heard varying opinions on this, there's something called PFICs, which are basically the perspective of the IRS is that any type of a mutual fund or ETF could be considered basically subject to U.S. tax and then not at a very favorable tax rate. Now, that's typically a Canadian mutual fund, Canadian ETF, seg fund. If it's in a non-registered account or a TFSA, passive foreign investment corporation is the actual term.
Okay.
And the short term is PFIC, PFIC. If there's a potential risk that if you don't report that as the proper income, there could be a significant taxation on that, because typically it will be taxed at like 39%, even if it is a capital gain by the IRS.
Yeah.
So there are ways to get around that, which we have basically figured out. Obviously, being Canadians, Canadians are very touchy about currency conversion. So,
yes,
they
we
meet
are.
with their US financial advisor and they said, well, I got $1 million I want to transfer from my non-registered account over to your over to you. And the institution in the US is delighted. Oh, we'd love to have your $1 million. And then the client says, well, right now the Canadian dollar is at 73.5 cents US. I don't want to convert to US dollars. And that's where the US institution typically will say, well, we have to do that conversion.
Have to at some point. Yeah. You can't keep it Canadian forever, right?
Well, here's the thing. We have the ability at One Capital to actually make that conversion. We make that move of assets from a Canadian brokerage account to a US brokerage account without converting to US dollars. We have the ability to manage Canadian dollar accounts here in the US. I do it all the time.
That's great.
Anything from cash to a fully invested stock and bond portfolio.
Okay.
Right. And we can also do the same thing the other way around for the American family moving to Canada. And they said, well, we're not ready to convert to US dollars for whatever reason. We can open up a US dollar account in Canada.
In Canada. So if someone's moving, when do you think is the right time to deal with this kind of conversion or transfer? Because some of our clients might be like, I'm only going for a year, and others are, this is a permanent move. What's the ideal timing that makes sense for clients?
It's on a case-by-case basis, of course. Okay. So if someone was making a short-term move to the US, they knew it was a temporary relocation, I probably would avoid that. I probably wouldn't bother making that kind of a move if I didn't have to. Again, always consult with the tax advisor first, and obviously, but short-term moves, maybe not. If you know that it's going to be, or you intend it to be a permanent move, again, the timing of this should be consistent with the tax strategy that your CPA makes, and a lot of times it centers around the calendar
year. Yeah.
So you want to basically talk with your tax advisor and say, my plan is I'm going to relocate to the US before or after July 1st. That seems to be a demarcation line for a lot of CPAs. And obviously, if you're planning on relocating after July 1st, then a lot of times you get a little bit more flexibility before you have to transfer assets between then and the end of the year. But if you're going to move in the first half of the year, then probably you're going to be looking at transferring assets sooner than that. But again, this is where you want to, again, collaborate with the CPA and the financial advisor together. They cannot be working in silos. They have to be collaborating together on this type of discussion.
Okay. No, that's really good information because, you know, some of our clients will ask things like that. And I'm like, until you know where you're going to be long term, just
And
leave it as is, as far as, you
right.
know, and
One
then,
of the strategies that this is specifically for California, people moving to California.
Mhm.
It's California actually the franchise tax board in California actually taxes RSPs as if they're individual accounts.
God.
FYI, only in California, of
So that
course.
means don't move to California. Is that what you're saying?
I not no,
Leave
I
your
wouldn't say
RSPs
that.
behind.
No, you leave the no, okay, first starts that's we're going off into another area.
That's fine.
So I'm not saying that you would not, uh, you wouldn't cash your RSPs out because you moved to the United States.
Mhm.
If you have a significant amount of capital accumulated in your RSPs, it probably makes sense to maintain them.
Yeah.
Now, what we've done, my wife and I've done, we've actually converted our RSPs to US dollar investment accounts. So even
Oh,
though
okay.
it's an RSP custodied at a Canadian custodian, the investments in the RSP are all US dollar.
Oh, okay. So that can be done too.
But one of the things for those who maybe don't want to do that for whatever reason, maybe against a currency conversion issue, one of the things that's been suggested by some of the cross-border CPAs I know is that you basically do a sale of all your assets just before you leave the country and start a new cost basis. So you're
Mm,
not carrying that cost basis across the border with you. So
okay.
you may have had RSP accounts in place. And remember, in Canada, it's a tax-free. The investments in there are tax sheltered. There's no risk.
Yep.
So
Yeah.
you can sell everything, and you know if you want, you can buy it all back and restart the cost basis just before you cross the border. And that
Oh
way
my
you
God. Look at that. I love it. Very creative. So what about an American owner or families, say families with businesses and other assets, and they want to move to Canada? What do they need to think about in terms of their wealth management? Is it
well,
very
I want to
different?
kind of I'm going to steal some of my previous content here and talk a bit about the tools that we have in Canada that are
Yep.
not available to American taxpayers. And the first one I'll talk about is the TFSA.
Yeah.
If you're an American coming to Canada, you hear all about this great TFSA program where you can put money in
Hmm.
and store it there and take it out tax free, put it back in, all of that, which the Canadians have such great benefit of. That will not apply if they are a U.S. taxpayer. They'd have to relinquish their U.S. citizenship before they
Oh.
could get advantage to that. So that would be one. That would be the
They
one
have to
thing.
become Canadian citizens, Wayne?
No, you no. It's about the U.S. Remember, when you're a U.S. taxpayer, you have exposure to worldwide income.
Worldwide income. Got it.
You would have to literally relinquish your U.S. citizenship.
Yeah.
I would, and I would sort of think that would be kind of maybe overkill,
Mhm.
depending on your own personal preferences
Yeah.
of relinquishing your citizenship just so that you can get access to a TFSA might be uh, that would be a bit
That
drastic.
that would be
So
very drastic.
the other thing again I'm going to refer back to is the discussion we had earlier about the passive foreign investment corporations.
Mhm.
Not only does it apply to a Canadian moving to the US who still has their Canadian mutual funds, ETFs, um, segregated funds, it also applies to an American coming to Canada.
Mm, okay.
Okay, but if you're in Canada, you're an American citizen. Like for me, I'm an American citizen now. If I move back to Canada, these rules apply to me now.
But aren't you Canadian still?
Doesn't matter. I'm a U.S. taxpayer.
Because it's worldwide income. Got it.
I'm a U.S. citizen. There's something else we need to talk about too, just before we I'll bring it up here in a minute. So
Yeah.
the passive foreign investment corporations, the mutual funds,
Mhm.
again, you got to be very careful if you're a U.S. person that you got to be careful in what you invest in because you'd be again subject to that passive foreign investment corporation
Oh my
tax issue.
God. Wow.
The other thing, this has happened. I've seen this happen with clients of mine. Home ownership. One of the most beautiful things about living in Canada
Hmm.
is that house that you have, and this applies either going in either direction here. The home you have in Canada, principal residence of yours that you
Yeah.
maybe have owned for many, many years, and maybe you bought it back in 2001 and you paid $250,000, and now you're looking at relocating to the U.S. and the current market says that same property is worth almost 800, 900, maybe $1 million.
Hmm.
Holy smokes! if you sell that home before you leave the country, you pay zero capital gains on it. But if you continue to own that property, all of a sudden, real estate, if you're an American citizen owning real estate, you're subject to capital gains tax,
Yeah.
right? So so even again, if you're moving across the border from the United States to Canada and you buy a property here, understand that, you're not going to have that same benefit of a Canadian citizen, Canadian resident with no U.S. tax ties. They can buy our principal residence and not have to pay any capital gains tax. If you move here, even like if you decide I'm moving from, California to Alberta or Ontario or Nova Scotia, wherever it may be, and you decide you're going to put up stakes there and this is going to be my home forevermore, that property, as long as you're a U.S. taxpayer, is going to be subject to capital gains when you sell it. There's an individual tax exclusion of $250,000, but any gains be above and beyond that.
Oh my gosh. Wow. So, do you do this work, Wayne, to also help, like, I know you deal with high net worth clients, and some of my clients are too, and they've got wealth that they want to also try to pass down to
part of what we talk about is multi-generational wealth transfer. That's a big part of our discussion.
And so how are you, so besides the cross-border, even the multi-generational wealth and helping the younger generation understand all these issues, do you educate them in this as well, or?
Well, in order to proceed, a client has to be well informed because they're ultimately the ones that are making decisions. So you're absolutely right. That's part of the benefit of the 3 Questions podcast that we have, as you know. And you've been a wonderful guest of mine.
It's a great podcast. Yeah.
Thank you. Again, education is everything. And unfortunately, it's amazing. I started in financial services back in October of 1994. And, it amazes me, and I guess partly that's part of my maybe some Canadian naivete. I don't know, but it amazes me to this day how uninformed the vast majority of people are when it comes to quote unquote wealth management. So an important role that we play. And again, as a fiduciary, which, when you're with One Capital, we're considered a fiduciary. We're a fee only. We don't make commissions on investment trades. We simply bill the client a quarterly advisory fee or annual advisory fee that's quarterly. So our job is to educate and inform our clients. And the way we start that is by asking a lot of questions and gathering a lot of information from them and trying to find out what it is they want to accomplish. Right. And every individual family and every individual situation is unique. So there's no real cookie cutter solution. So we have to basically work on an individual basis and basically devise a plan that's specifically for that particular family or individual.
Okay. That's fabulous.
So, and it covers everything. The list, if you will, estate planning, tax planning, risk management. And in the States, risk management takes on a new meaning, and I can get into that. Investing, obviously. But then on top of that, there's credit, there's real estate, immigration for clients. These are all things that we literally talk about. And but it all starts, my experience, a lot of this starts with, the monthly cash flow of that family. So one of the first discussions we have is, how do you spend your money every month? What do you spend it on? Right. And obviously you have to understand what kind of incomes they have, how much they've accumulated already. But I mean, that's really where it starts from the family cash flow and, what is it they want to achieve? Right. And so every family, as you can see right from there, when you start talking about individual family cash flow, you look at the neighborhood that you live in, Evelyn, everybody has their own cash flow issues and situation. So you can't possibly have a sort of one size fits all solution for. It's impossible.
Our
role is to really understand and everybody has different visions of how they want to see their lives unfold. It's very unique. So the fun part of my work is meeting people and learning about their situations and finding out, what they want to achieve. For some families, multi-generational wealth planning is super important. And you have other clients who will tell you that they hope that the check to the mortician bounces. I mean, I can go to those two extremes, right? If you want.
I just finished reading a book, Wayne. It's called Die with Zero. I don't know if you've heard about it.
Yeah.
And
Well,
it's this
it may
guy.
have been
No,
written
he's
by
very
me, but
wealthy. He's very wealthy. Forget his name, Brad Perkins or something like that. And he's very, very, very wealthy. But his whole philosophy is give it to your children while they can do things with
it
it
was a
while you're
warm hand, my client called it. Giving
exactly, as
a warm
opposed to
hand.
wait till you're gone and then you hand them all these millions and dollars. And so it's kind of like help them through life, giving to them through the process so that at the end, when you're done, there's nothing left to give them predominantly because you've already taught them how to take care of money through their life. It's a pretty interesting book, but so listen, I know that you and I both work with tax advisors and tax specialists a lot because that's not what we are. And I count on
I don't
them.
play one on TV either, I like to
I
tell
don't
people.
either. I don't even look like I could be one. I hate taxes like everybody else. How do you work with your clients to bring in a tax advisor? Do you bring them in? Do they bring their own? Do you have them with one
That's a really good
capital?
question. Okay, so typically it starts with the client, and if they have a relationship that they're happy with, and one of the things we're again talking about my cross-border clients,
Mm-hmm.
that's a unique skill. Not every CPA is knowledgeable about the other country's tax rules.
Yeah.
So if it is a cross-border client, the first thing we'll discuss is whether or not their existing CPA is proficient. If they are, then we're set and we just carry on. It's just important that the client makes the introduction and we can have some working collaboration.
Yes.
If the client's CPA is clearly not able to do cross-border tax planning, the options are either A, we sync them up with let's say it's a Canadian CPA for the sake of this discussion.
Mm-hmm.
We'll connect the client with a US based CPA who will collaborate with the Canadian one. Preferably, if you were to ask me if I had my druthers, if you will, I would recommend that the client work with a CPA who is able to do both. It's going to be less expensive because you're not having to pay two CPAs to effectively prepare, one tax
Yeah.
regime, one tax plan. So having one CPA that typically can understand, and the key part is it can't just simply be someone who can fill in the fields on a tax return. They actually can provide tax advice and
Yes.
direction. Assuming
Yeah.
that they have that ability, I would recommend that they work with a cross-border firm. And I have relationships with cross-border tax experts in Canada, and I've
Good.
also been able to foster a few here in the US. Although I will tell you, one of the biggest challenges I had when I first moved down here was finding CPAs that can do both. They
That's what I
all,
hear all the time
yeah,
from my clients. So you and I will have to
right.
talk. I need a few of those people on your list. I have some people I refer, but depending on the level of the
I'm
client,
happy we can offline. I can make some
yeah,
introductions
I
to
would love
folks.
that
But
because
yeah,
the more
it's
high
so
net
funny.
worth, the more sophisticated the advice they're getting needs to be, and we want to make sure they're getting good advice. So I always say tax drives before I do anything is figure out how you want to deal with your taxes, and then I'll tell you how immigration can work. And I guess you're real, besides helping your clients with wealth management, you also help them with minimizing the tax burden, right? Like you obviously know enough
Well,
to
a
be
part of it
able to help them
is
work with the accountants and the tax specialists. Yeah.
well, again, I'm not a CPA, and I always defer to CPAs on this. So my job is to recognize obvious, tax issues, and
Yeah.
then basically alert them and direct them to a CPA.
Mm-hmm.
But on the investment side, I'll share a little bit on that. So we're
Yeah.
portfolio managers, and again, is we deal with a lot of individual stocks and exchange traded funds. And the key when you're dealing with a taxable account, which is in Canadian terminology, a non-registered account,
Mm-hmm.
uh, either be joint or individual, is the tax minimization is all on the way you tax trade a portfolio.
Okay.
So the way if you have, when you own individual positions, you own individual shares in the company, or you own ETFs, it's the ability to basically tax trade that portfolio to minimize the amount of tax the clients face at the end of the year. So
Mm-hmm.
that there are multiple a lot of people call it tax loss harvesting. So there's some strategies that you can incorporate where you're able to you buy a company that you've liked and think it's a great company, has great potential going forward, but the shares drop during the year because of conditions beyond its control, and all of a sudden the share price goes from $10 a share to say $7.50. Well, you still like that company, but there are some ways you can actually realize that loss. You can do that as like multiple different strategies that you can use in terms of selling the stock, waiting 31 days, buying it back. You can buy proxy positions either in terms of ETFs or other companies, or you can just double down and buy more shares of that same company. There's multiple different strategies that you can use to realize that loss, so that you may have another company that you really like, but its share price has gone from $10 to $12.50 or $13 or $14, and you're saying, that's getting a bit rich. I want to realize some profits. Well, now you can take the benefit of that tax loss you've created for the other company that you traded at a loss, realize the capital gain on the other position, and the client ultimately doesn't have to pay any taxes. That's a very simplistic explanation.
No, that sounds incredible. You obviously know what you're doing and you love what you're doing.
That's for sure.
You were just telling me before we got on live that there were some recent changes again to the American tax.
Oh boy, yeah, you were going to bring that up. Yeah, so the Corporate Transparency Act is, this is the big talk for it here. And again, it's actually potentially applicable to not just Americans, but it was enacted in Congress. It's called the Corporate Transparency Act, or CTA. It was enacted in Congress in January 2021. It's a part of the National Defense Authorization Act. And the real basis of this is focuses on reforming anti-money laundering laws here in the U.S. And what it requires wants to establish is beneficial ownership of corporations. And these would be like LLCs, for example, or other similar entities. And so basically what is required is the owners of these entities, the ones who are the beneficial owners, if you're already own the entity already before the beginning of this year, you have until the end of the year to complete this form that you have to do for. It's basically required by the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network in the US, called FinCEN. And it's not just applicable to US based entities. It could also be related to foreign entities who have established these entities in the United States. But you have to have that done. Again, if you created the entity before the beginning of the year, you have until the end of the year. If you've created an entity within this year, you have 90 days to complete this form. And if you don't, the penalties are, let's just call them punitive.
I'm going to write this down again. So what is it called again?
The Corporate Transparency Act, CT.
Transparency Act. Okay. Because I literally just talked to a client that just set up a US LLC. I want to make sure she knows.
They should be talking to the attorney.
Make sure. I will tell her.
Surprised. You cannot shake a stick without hearing an attorney talking about the Corporate Transparency Act. I am not kidding. It is all buzz here in the US.
I know.
But here's the crazy.
At a ProVisors meeting, and somebody was doing a whole presentation about it.
The timing. This is the fun part. The timing of our discussion today could not have been better, because guess what? Yesterday, the U.S. District Court in the District of Alabama declared the Corporate Transparency Act unconstitutional. So now we got people going, well, do we have to utilize this?
Yes, please cover your butt.
Earlier today, I had a conversation with a CPA down here in Southern California, and his sagely advice was, you know what? At this time, I would err on the side of caution and proceed as if it is going to be the law.
Because it's probably going to go up to maybe Supreme Court. Who knows, right? And
we'll see. But better to be act or be acted upon, I think, is the approach that we should be taking.
I agree with that. So tell me, Wayne, while we move on to your podcast, because you've been having a very successful podcast for a number of years now. Tell us about your podcast and the topics that you cover that are related to cross-border wealth management. And I've been very fortunate to be on your podcast and asked 3 questions. Very pointed.
Yes. And then I asked a couple more, as you may pointed out to me by somebody.
I love it.
There's more than 3 questions,
I
Wayne.
know. You find your way to
So,
get all the information.
okay, long story short. So I will say that back in the 2000s, I did host a radio show in Toronto for many years
Oh
on
my God. Which
AM
station?
740, AM 740,
Wow.
called right in Toronto.
Yep.
Right on the money it was called, and I love doing that. And so I have a little bit of background in talking into a microphone without getting
Of course you do. You're a whiz at this. Wow.
So when I went down to the US, I thought, I'm not going to get back into that again. And a couple, 3 years ago, I was asked to do some webcasts for a organization back east called the Canadian Entrepreneurs of New England. So it was basically 4 live webinars, each an hour long. And I had a gentleman out of New Orleans, good Lord, out of Las Vegas, who helped me put these together. His name was Lee
Great.
Pettit. Really appreciate Lee to this day. And after we did the last one, he said, you should really be doing these for yourself, not just doing it for somebody else. So I sat down one Saturday afternoon. I made a list of about 50 people that I knew here personally that I've met since I moved to the US, and people I've known in Canada for years, and figured what topics we could have. And I did a few test runs to see how it would look, and talked to the senior management at One Capital Management. They thought it was a great idea.
Yeah.
And so, we cover, surprise, surprise, a lot of wealth management related topics: estate planning, tax planning, risk management, investing, immigration. I also, because we're dealing with Canadians relocating to the US, I also bring in a lot of, business related topics, just to educate Canadians on some of the things they need to think about if they're coming to the US with the intention of starting a new business. So I've interviewed several business professionals and looked at things from many different angles about starting a business, the tax issues, IP patent IP patent issues, intellectual property issues, tax segregation, you name it. We know a lot of content in that area to help people sort of bring them up to speed. So a lot of the content in the first year was really kind of cross-border related. Had property and casualty people come on and talk about things that Canadians would not even think about when it comes to owning a home in the US. Like, for example, it's one thing is that, before you buy a house in the US, if you're a Canadian, because in Canada, we just think about, well, I see a house, I want to buy it, and it's on the market, it's all good, just as long as I can negotiate something. Well, one of the first things you do down in the US, according to my property and casualty experts, is you got to figure out if this property can be insured.
Oh my God, especially in
Because
parts of California, right?
You got, well, not just California, but yeah, you can mention California as an example. So, Diane Beatty with Cal Insurance, she did a webcast with me. She talked about that. The first thing you got to figure out before you commit is this house insurable?
Oh my God.
There's no guarantees that it will be. The other thing that Canadians aren't aware about on that, we'll call this under the category of risk management.
Yeah.
Is Canadians, you ask the odd Canadian, the average Canadian, about umbrella insurance, I'll have no clue what you're talking about.
Nope.
Well, it's super important if you are coming to the US, and especially if you have any type of liquid net worth you're bringing with you, that you have an umbrella insurance policy, because that's what will effectively protect you from the potential of being sued.
Oh,
because
Lord.
if you're sued and you don't have an umbrella insurance, then that attorney that has been hired will be, next thing they'll be looking at will be at your own personal liquid assets. But typically, again, based on the experience I have in dealing with property and casualty, or with attorneys in that space, they will tell you the first thing they'll look at is do you have insurance? And they do. They basically just find out what they can get from that insurance policy.
Yeah.
So somebody in an accident, they'll typically hire an attorney to represent them, and that attorney will. One of the first questions they'll ask is, and I've seen it happen here recently, where a client of mine was sued, and he didn't have any. The first question the opposing attorney asked was, "Do you have insurance?" And this particular client did not, and it just was in the process of hiring me.
Oh, that's painful.
So I had a chance to advise them, and this particular lawsuit cost him several $100,000 that he had to take out of his own personal savings. Whereas if he had paid $500, $600 a year, the umbrella
Of
insurance
course.
policy would have paid.
That's so interesting. Well, I think I love your show. And what I love about your podcast too is that I get this email whenever something else comes up. I was telling my team, I said, this is so great. We need to like do this because we know right away something new has landed and we know what it's about, you know? And so you can take that few minutes to click on it and just
Here's
watch
the
it.
news. Here's the big, I guess, breaking news on that. So I started this as a YouTube
Yep.
channel
Yeah.
primarily. So what we're going to be doing, and this is applying to your episode as well,
Yeah.
is we are now going to convert all episodes going forward, or all episodes we've done, to podcasts, and we'll be posting them as well. So I will
Great.
be letting you know the week your
That's
episode is
great.
posted as a podcast. So it's going to be on podcasts and YouTube.
Yep.
And also,
That's
you know, you have
perfect. Because we do
no
both. Yeah, we do both. And I think you've got so much good information, Wayne, that it's like you need to share it, you know, and get it out there. So,
three questions. It's called the Three Questions webcast series. If folks are interested, they can go on YouTube and just type in the number three
mhm.
questions webcast series, and it will come up in all
There
the
you come
episodes.
up.
We just
Wow. Well,
we just launched our 61st episode
wow.
earlier today.
That's exciting. Congratulations. I
Thank you.
am so grateful that I got to meet you. One of my first introductions through Provisors, our professional networking referral group. It's been an incredible period of time. But everybody, when they find out what I do, they say, do you know Wayne? Do you know Wayne? Everybody. I was like, I know Wayne.
Good. Yeah. It's been Provisors has been the most incredible organization for me on every different level.
Yep.
And that's how actually, I didn't mention this earlier. That's how I met John Perry, the immigration attorney that I
That's
met
so
that.
great. That's how I met you. That's how I've met so many wonderful colleagues. And so I've been having some of them on. I'm so excited and happy and very honored that you were able to join us today on the Ask Canada
My
Immigration
pleasure.
Podcast. You're a great interview. I know you have lots of stories. I need to get to LA, I think, so we can have dinner. I'd love to be down
Can't
there,
wait. I guess
meet your wife and bring my husband and we can have some fun together.
I would love it. I would love it, love it, love it. You just give
Thank
me
you.
a heads up
You are the
and
best. And I want everybody to know that if you have questions, feel free to reach out to Wayne directly. We'll make sure when it gets posted on YouTube and on our podcast, we'll have all his contact information as well as his email address. So you can reach out directly because you need to know before you make that move cross-border.
100%. Better. Those who fail to plan to fail. Better to have
We
a
have that
plan
up
for.
in my office here somewhere. Thank you so much, Wayne. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure.